Everyone. Welcome to another recorded book discussion with Ann Arbor District Library and Unerased Book Club. Tonight we are discussing the novel Your Heart is a Muscle the Size of a Fist, sorry, and this is by Sunil Yapa. And before we get started, we'll just quickly go around and introduce ourselves so that you have a face to go with a voice. I'm Lucy. I'm a library tech at Ann Arbor District Library. I do a lot of youth programming, but I also do a lot of programming for adults. I am a white female in my early 50s. I have shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing glasses, and I'm sitting in front of a yellow wall with some stacks of books behind me.
Hi, I'm Anne. I'm a book processor at AADL, and I work primarily out of the Westgate branch. I am a mid-40s heavyset white woman with brown hair. It's currently pulled back into a ponytail, and I'm wearing glasses and a black V-neck shirt, sitting in front of a blurred office background.
And my name is Jacob. I'm a library tech at Ann Arbor District Library. I am a 31-year-old white male with dark blonde hair, beard, and mustache. I'm wearing a black Venom t-shirt, and I'm sitting in front of my kitchen pantry.
And hi, everyone. My name is Fatema Haque. I am one of the co-facilitators of the Unerased Book Club. I am a South Asian woman in her mid-30s, and I am wearing a navy blue sweatshirt, and I have long black hair, and I have a digital background of pink clouds and blue skies behind me. So thank you all so much for having us again. This is always such a pleasure. And today our book discussion is about a novel that is pretty heavy in that it takes place within the span of a day. With some flashbacks into the past, but a day where there are protesters peacefully demonstrating, and then also police officers trying to respond to that protest. And so, as always, we love to start with just what did you think of the book?
I enjoyed this read. I kept thinking to myself, I wish I was reading this at a different time. Sometimes you're just not ready to receive all of the wisdom and information and knowledge from a book. And that's where I found myself. So it's more of a user error, if you will. Um, I really enjoyed the multiple viewpoints. And I learned about something I had never even heard of, the WTO protests in 1999. So although I still have questions about the protests, it put something on my radar that had never been there in the first place. So that was really valuable.
I really liked this book. I thought the author did a really good job with the 7 viewpoints that we get. Some of them I felt were a little bit more fleshed out, but I think what that did was it gave it this really good frame of like everyone thought they were doing the right thing. This book does such a good job of exploring like who is doing the right thing and who's doing the wrong thing, and kind of good and bad, and like privilege, and there was just so much in it. I remember the WTO protests, but I remember them very much in the way that they were shown on TV, which was like violent protesters, you know. Um, and so it was interesting to read something that put faces and voices and humans behind all of that.
Yeah, the protest happened when I was a senior in college in a kind of isolated small town liberal arts college, so I had absolutely no clue. It wasn't until the actual police response started in this that I went, wait, is this based on something real and not just a made up thing? And so it was once again a wow, there's a lot of our history that I don't know, and a lot of it is even recent history that I was alive for. Um, I really enjoyed the book for the most part. I did find some of specifically the relationship between the estranged father and son, the police officer, and the homeless but more searching son. There was something that felt weird about it to me, because they were both trying to make it seem like they had been very close, but at the same time, it didn't feel like they knew each other or understood each other very well, which obviously is exacerbated by the fact that they were on opposite sides of this protest. But they were two of the more fleshed out characters, and I felt like there was something a little weird, or not true feeling to me in their relationship.
I also didn't know very much about or at anything really about this protest and don't remember it from when I was a child. Um, so that part itself was really cool piece of history to learn. But I found this to be a challenging read for a variety of reasons. One being the language itself. I think that the author is very elaborate and expensive and kind of circular in in the style of writing. And for me, that was oftentimes difficult to follow because, especially as the writing wove through time or memories. And so, are you in a scene where the protest is happening, or are you in the past when the central character of that particular chapter is remembering and experiencing something different that connects back? So all of that made for, at least this for me, a challenging read. I started with listening to the audiobook and I couldn't do it, so I had to go on to the paper version and read instead, and it still took me a very long time. And I think the other part that I found really difficult was that there is a lot of violent scenes described in the book, and it's heavy. It's extremely heavy, especially given that we've seen more and more protests in our lifetime, in the last couple of decades, even, or just the last decade, and that made those protests even more real, I think, for me at least.
Yeah, I think there's really something to be said always about like reading. I mean, it is historical fiction in a way, so you have to think about the time period it's talking about. You have to think about the time it was written in, which was 2016, and then like the time when you're reading it. And so we have all these, like you're saying, Fatima, all this other protests to kind of build on, and it did find that it was like really evocative of even like the past year and thinking about all the protests that happened. And yeah, there were some scenes like the way that the officers used pepper spray and tear gas was horrifying. Um and I thought it was hard to read that, but also hard to see in those moments like how those people felt that they were doing the right thing, but then you get this other side of them too. So it was it's like confusing, but I don't mean like necessarily. It's confusing in that you're like, wait, are you, what's your, who are you? And I also did feel that with the language, some of the characters were much more like in their mind or stream of consciousness, almost like I did get confused sometimes with King, like where was she? Was she in the desert? Was she um at the protest? Was she so I think though the stories were really strong and telling, some I think some places it got a little muddled for me, or I got a little confused with what was going on.
I am going to struggle to try to describe what I'm going to say, so just bear with me. But there is Like, let's say you go see a movie and there's a difference from saying that was a really good movie. There's a difference between saying that and saying, wow, what an experience, or that moved me. Um, because when you say the first thing, you're still aware of the machinations of it being a film. The way that this book was written was very much a capital W writing and a writer being a capital W writer. And showing off isn't the right word. I like showing off. Showing off is good, but I saw too much of how the sausage was made, and it didn't let me. I didn't go, what delicious sausage. I went, oh, it's pretty interesting how this guy made this sausage. Kind of convoluted, and there's a lot of steps to make this sausage. But I'd really rather just be like, what a delicious sausage. I'm cracking myself up. I'm sorry. I did not. Okay. Does that make any sense?
No, I think it totally does. What I hear you saying is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the writing was so painstakingly like trying to express the internalized thoughts and feelings of the characters to a point where you were like, is this the author's voice speaking or is this the character?
Yes. And it was like he was saying, this is profound.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm the person who's supposed to be saying, this is profound.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
There were a few moments that I did think was where I think it stayed very much with me. The first moment was when I think it was Park was found Victor, the young houseless boy who was trying to sell weed at this protest, and so he was about to target, and I think King looks away. King, the other police officer, looks away, and the very act of like, oh, look at that, he's about to confront this child, and yet I'm just going to look away because sometimes police have to do that. And I thought that was particularly move. I don't, it's those questions you ask, like, how can someone witness that and not do something about it? And it really highlighted just how easy it can be to look away. And I think that was like, there were little moments like that that was captured so well. And and then there are other moments where I was like, this still feels unreal. I know it happens, but it still feels very unreal.
And in the 8 years since it's been written, so much has changed, um, politically, and just how we exist in America, that some of those messages of um, everyone's heart contains goodness and badness, and like some of the messaging you had just described, Fatima, it's like, I'm not hearing that right now. I would like to hear that in the future, but and especially with it being the holidays, I'm like, I'm not feeling that. And yeah,
Yeah, I think it was really interesting to get this perspective from the police officers now, as you know, just in what has happened since 2016, and to think about the role of police officers, and just how they act at protests and where they've acted elsewhere publicly, and when they've been held accountable and when they haven't. But it was interesting to get an inside perspective, like the female police officer. She kept talking about her training and like how they were trained basically to react, like like quickly, and it's hard to read that and think, but maybe that's not, like that's where the problem is. Like, you're going to shoot this woman this person who's climbing up on your truck or whatever that thing was, because you're trained to just like do the thing first and then think about what you're doing. And I don't know if that is true to police training, but it did kind of like, I don't know, it was just interesting to think about that and to read that. And and it was frustrating. Um, but I also appreciated, I guess, getting like, especially from her, what she was kind of going through.
I had a reaction to another point of view from a police officer that I'm sure it was somehow training initiated or instilled, and just culturally, but it baffled me that this was the conclusion that he came to, and it was when Chief Bishop, the father, was looking at the chaos going on around him and his response. I'm just going to read a little bit here. And it wasn't that Bishop had only scheduled 900 officers. No, his mistake today, he thought, was very simple. He had been too kind. He had allowed himself to trust these people. Kids spitting in the streets. These weren't peaceful protesters. These weren't decent people. These were punks and trash. And just like how he could look at what was going on around him and the way his officers were behaving and take that away from it was just like, I don't even, you're showing me what this guy is thinking, but I don't even understand because I don't see how you come to that conclusion.
And yeah, I think that's the way it's like sold through the media then, that exact viewpoint. Like, the police should have been tougher and those protesters were violent and you know, yeah, it's so you like to hear that that's what the police officer's thinking in the middle of it. Is really something. Yeah, I didn't know how to feel about Bishop because on one hand, I don't know, I guess he's wishing he did better by his son sometimes, but um he also is like the person thinking what you just described. And I think that's one of the things about this book in general, that there were all these dichotomies within a lot of the characters that made it challenging.
Yeah, and I also kept thinking like how would this protest be different today? There was a lot happening that didn't have witnessing, right? They mentioned that they had asked for media to be there and called all these outlets and whatnot. And I don't know that it was covered in the same way. But I think like in today where you can live stream things and whatnot, I wonder which direction the public would have cited and if the outcome would have been different. I mean, some of the descriptions of the way that the police reacted was just absolutely horrific. And I know that still happens today, regardless of, social media or whatever else. It's still very, um, I don't know. Part of me wants to think that it could be different, but I don't know that it is.
To understand more about the protests, I watched some videos on YouTube, and this video is from the Wall Street Journal, and it is a video that explained how policing large-scale protests, the thought process behind how to police them changed after these protests. And basically, what they found was that when you have people who are peacefully protesting, and you imagine this, and you pepper spray them, they become non-peaceful. I'm like, I watched an 8-minute video, and that's what we landed on. Um, but I think the video was trying to make the point that they became a structural change about how people were trained. But then think about Ferguson. I mean, if police by and large understand that, well, then that almost makes it worse. You understand what you're doing is going to cause unrest and chaos, and yet, um, it was a fascinating experience, especially coming from the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, I mean, even on a lower scale, you think about like the college campuses, all those protests that happened in this past year. There was a lot of pepper spray used, and it's really interesting to ask a protester to be like, "No, you remain peaceful and calm whilst I spray you with this." Like it's like poking a bear and then being surprised that the bear reacts to that. It's not that the protesters are a bear, but you know what I'm saying? It's like you can't just ask someone to lie there. And I don't know. So it's interesting, Jacob, that you saw them take 8 minutes to explain that to you.
Yeah, I think that we've talked about the different cops and their perspective, but I think it was really interesting to see the way the different protesters were reacting to those changes in um, stimuli, I guess, uh, and how you know initially Victor like was sitting there going, I can't do this. I can't be here. What am I doing? Like, I don't want to. And that ended up turning into a resolve and a, hey, I can fix this. Whereas you had King go from very resolved to suddenly kind of violent and then back to a type of resolve, but still in well, violent isn't necessarily, but I'm going to physically stop what's happening versus um, just nonviolent uh, methods. And then you had John Henry, who just stuck with that nonviolent thread throughout the entire thing, which I appreciated seeing all of the different reactions where even if everybody is going into it with the intent of nonviolent protesting, people are people and they respond differently given different situations.
I did wonder what would happen if it had remained as a peaceful protest, right? So, um, I keep thinking back to my first experience of Hash Bash here in Ann Arbor, and how I remember seeing police officers handing out water and not citing anyone and just being like very friendly. Um, and it was such a striking difference because at the time it was not legal and all of these other things, right? Um, and I juxtapose that with something like a peaceful protest and just how much more defensive everyone is in that scenario. And I think like, well, what would have been the case? So they blocked the intersection for a day. Could it is that the anticipation is that it would go on for days and days and days, and then you'd have to do something as the way we've seen some of the college campus protests around the country this year? Or is it like what is the impetus for breaking it up right away instead of being like, I'm going to let people have their say and then they're going to go home?
Well, and the protesters early on in the day we saw were perfectly ready to get arrested. Like
Yeah.
there wasn't a we're going to sit here and nothing's going to happen at all. Like they expected a response, but they expected kind of a respectful response in return for the peacefulness that they were bringing to it.
And they did shut down. I mean, they were successful in stopping the WTO meetings from happening but that was on the very first day. So it's kind of like, if you read about this, and this book doesn't get into it, this lasted for like 5 days or something. It's like, what? Yeah. Um, why? But yet they were successful, at least some of them, in something that they wanted to do. There were also like 60,000 protesters, not all of whom had the same goal in mind. So Yeah, but yeah, you're right. That's interesting to think about. Like if the police had just said, "Okay, do your,
Mhm.
thing." Um, I don't know. I'd also never heard of a. I think looked them up. They're called like immovable circle dragon or something. I'd never heard of that, where people put their arms through
The
PVC
pipe.
pipes. So I had to look at like images of it because I didn't really understand. But um, that was kind of wild
And
to me to read about that.
in some ways, this felt like a 2016 how to peacefully protest because it was going over like uh, one part Malox to one part water is good for tear gas in the or pepper spray in the it was, and this is how you do this kind of immovable lockdown, and this is it was. I, I was both grateful for that information and at the same time it felt very pointed.
Mhm. Yeah. As well as the idea. So one of the other scenes that sticks to my mind is the old man who used a bicycle lock to lock himself um into, I think, a building or a gate or something. Um and then the lesson being that you always got to have somebody else to replace you, so that one person alone, for 15 minutes you stop something, but it's not lasting. So you need that a larger number of people. So there are like little lessons like that scattered throughout. What did folks think of the intermissions that were scattered throughout the book?
That was really a place that spoke about privilege to me a little bit. Like here are these people protesting, and in a way, it's a privilege to be able to like. They don't they don't have as much to lose as a lot of the people that they are protesting for, ostensibly. But then you get these intermissions of this man who's from a country that wants to be part of the WTO, and um, but he also was a really um, he was also like a very two-faced almost character, and that he was willing to talk about his country, not always in the best way, depending on who he's talking to. Um, So I found them at first. I was a little confused, but then I enjoyed reading those. I felt like he was a little bit of a plot device rather than a character, but I did enjoy the other layer of perspective.
I would I would like more clarity. I understand that these protests were about um, globalization and the World Trade Organization, but when I say those things, I don't really understand what they really mean. I have an idea I'm able to grasp, but I feel like I'm missing so much context. Or there's parts that I'm missing. Um, then I read the Wikipedia page and I'm like, uh. So do you get? Please explain. Can somebody give me some clarity?
Apparently, no. Well, I mean, there there's definitely the not even just seeds, but beginning growth of the multinational corporations being the overarching power structure. But within the book, like reading it, I kind of felt like you did because initially I was like, oh, this meeting is to see if Sri Lanka is going to join the WTO. I'm like, no, this is about something much greater than that. Um, and yeah, globalization is one of those things that's just a word that we grew up going into, but not having a full understanding.
I think so. This is one of I would say the failures of the book, right? Is and perhaps the frustrations for me as a reader of the book is not setting the context up really well. Like I noticed that it wasn't until like the end of chapter 1, like on page 6 or 7, that I even knew that we were in Seattle. or that the year was 1999, right? So like not even setting up a location, right? They're like, eh, we start with him, under a overpass, a houseless person, Victor, and noticing all these points. But I don't know where that overpass is. I mean, is it in Asia? Is it in, Europe? Is it in America? Like what, how do you know? And so I think like there's that thread of confusion throughout. And um it wasn't until the Charles, the delegate from Sri Lanka, was arrested and put on the bus, and he tries to hear out all the other protesters who'd been arrested, um, that that I start to get a hint of where the protesters might be coming from. But it is such a grab bag of things, right? It's everything from environmental concern and Monsanto and to free trade agreements and labor rights and just everything, right? And it's really, really, I guess it would be very challenging to succinctly summarize that in any way, right? Um, but I think, does that make it harder to, I don't know, like take direct action, or even like make it harder to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve in this scenario? Because obviously the globalization effort only intensified. I mean, look at how we are today.
Yeah, I wonder, even if you'd asked some of or many of the protesters there, like, what are you protesting for? What is this for? That you might hear back like, we want justice, we want it now, we want, like there was a lot of that, but that might be all you get. Like, it's like with that many people, and and I think that's what I was trying to say about privilege too. It's like you'd have this like, I can just go join this protest because bad things are happening to people in the world. They're not getting their fair due, or we're taking, we're commodifying and capitalizing, and we're making businesses bigger here and not, taking away business from elsewhere.
Yep.
But again, like the people who they say they're standing up for can't really, maybe wouldn't even be, I don't know, but like if you would you risk, you'd have to risk more to protest, I guess. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think that there's so many pieces of it, and it is convoluted, that I'm not even sure that everyone there would know what they were protesting, just that they felt that they were doing the right and good thing because they were protesting something big and corporate and government oriented.
Um,
Yeah, it's like a savior complex, right? That they were trying to save all these people, these third world in quotes, um, countries. But I don't know that they fully understand all those other aspects of it. The fact that so many people are struggling, and that it would be a boon or a benefit to them um, to be part of the system instead of trying to still evade it.
that's one of the things that I really liked about the interludes,
Mhm.
um, with Charles, is because it it initially introduced that, like, "Hey, we want this. We want to be included in this big thing." But then by the end of the story, it was like, well, he's just been duped this whole time, and you know, it it's one of those messy things where you want people to be able to develop their societies, but you also don't want them to get taken advantage of, and it's hard to have both of those things happen in a capitalist system.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I was actually kind of glad to it's gonna sound bad. I was kind of glad that he got the sense that he'd been duped, or he was like being made fun of a little bit, because the way he was talking about his country and people, and look at how backward we are. We're still farming the old way. We don't have machinery to do it for us or whatever else. Like it was really humiliating and putting, and I just like, you are really putting yourself down just to appease these, or just to align yourself with these people who clearly don't have your best interest, if that's what they're believing, right? um and so yeah, I don't know, I for me it was just kind of like, it was very much of like, well, now you know, because you thought that you were doing all this for 5 years, for flying around, meeting with all these people, and talking shit about your own country, and here you are.
Another, just slightly changing topics, but within the globalization, I understand the purpose of having the famous actress who had adopted a baby from Sri Lanka and having King's story of crossing the border as aspects of globalization being shown, but they felt like there was already so much stuff going on. It felt really unnecessary to add those aspects into it as well.
Yeah, I feel like there was also a little bit of like almost like a checklist, like, oh, let's have this police officer who is behaving like, horribly here, but he was actually saved a lot of people in the Oklahoma City bombing. And let's have, this other police officer have been involved in the LA riots, and let's someone be crossing the border, and so it was like it didn't even always feel, it felt sometimes convenient or too neatly packaged, which seems weird to say about a book that doesn't feel like a neat package in that it's like explosive. But there were some times where I was like, huh, that's, it just it came together. Like the seven characters came together in a way that I didn't think maybe um seemed authentic.
Mm. It goes back to Jacob's earlier comment of seeing how the sausage is made and thinking, oh, so this is how the sausage is made. Um,
It was like the recipe, he's like, check, I have that, check, I have that, 2 cups of that. Yep.
I think it's interesting that this was the debut novel by this author. Um, and I was really curious about like what drove the author to write about this particular topic. I didn't do a lot of reading on the author. I was just curious if anyone else had.
I listened to one interview with him where I think he started writing it when he was like a graduate student, and he was like traveling, and he had this book that was like 800 pages on his computer, and he was being stupid and didn't back it up, and somehow he lost it. That was this book, which would have been 800 pages. Um, and so he couldn't come back to it for a while, because that was like kind of emotionally devastating. Um, and then something made him return to it. So not only did he write this book once, he wrote it essentially twice. It doesn't really explain his impetus for doing it. I think he said he saw some images on TV and he thought, what is the story behind that? And then he kind of went from there. But
His
I was
degree,
like, wow. Yeah.
yeah, his bachelor's degree, it says, was in economic geography, which I didn't know that was a bachelor's degree, but it certainly sounds like what could lead you into this topic.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I feel like this being his debut novel is both a super ambitious debut novel, but it also explains some of the clunkiness in the execution.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. And to date, it has been his only novel or book published.
Which is interesting. I mean, maybe if you write something like this and you write it twice, it's going to take you a long time to formulate something else. It just seems like in this day, um, that's like almost 10 years. That's 8 years is seems like to be a longer time between books for especially for newer authors.
Have any of you read other protest related works that you would recommend?
It is so crazy you would ask that, and I don't know if I would recommend this particular book for different reasons, but I just read a book called True Biz by Sarah Novick, Novic,
Mhm.
and it's about a deaf high school and students who, towards the end of the novel, uh, get in touch with anarchist protesters, and they're like making bombs and stuff. I don't know if I like how that book handled it because it kind of felt like Degrassi does anarchism. It felt like Reese's Book Club does anarchism, but I still appreciated it, and I learned a lot about the art of protest, why people protest, why certain protests are closer to the forefront of our mind as a culture than others. Um, I would recommend that book to anybody, but I would want to talk about what they thought about the aspects of protest and civil disobedience that came out of that book.
I also will echo that recommendation because I really did love that book, especially because I learned so much about deaf culture, and then also a lot of the things that um, deaf rights, I guess, that because I didn't know the politics of, say, like a hearing aid or other things, and I really appreciated the way the book incorporated all of that. And as someone who doesn't have it, hearing issues, um, for me, it was just so informative and enlightening, and I appreciated it a lot.
Yeah, I would agree with that also. I it's funny, Jacob, hearing you say that about the anarchist, the bit, and I do remember that, but it's not like I read it a long time ago or not whenever it came out. And it's funny because I was like, oh wait, that was in that book? Because it's my takeaway was like I learned so much from that book and I felt so much more informed about deaf rights and the things that like hearing people think are the best path forward for deaf people that aren't, and even the way they use their bodies and sign language, it just, so yeah, like those were all the things that stuck with me. But now that you're saying that, I'm like, oh yeah, that also happened in that book. um so it's just funny what you end up remembering. I'm listening to a book right now called Libertad, and it's about it takes place in Honduras, like kind of during two time periods, 2009, so that there was a coup during that time, and then later in 2017, and it's about a girl, Libertad, and her brother and her mom, but she's narrating it from 2017. And there are protests going on at that time because there is this election that's going to happen, and like her brother and her grandmother feel very differently about the two sides of who's running, and the the protests are starting to ramp up. And it was just really interesting to be listening to that at the same time that I was reading this, and just seeing these two different ways and places that protests were coming up. And in the case of like Honduras, it seemed so much more central to their very way of living, um so it's been interesting to have these two different, like, they're completely different, but it's just, yeah, people protesting.
What was the title of that book?
It's called Libertad, so it's Libertad. It's a young adult book, but it's really good so far.
What comes to my mind is the March books by John Lewis and others. It's a graphic. I don't want to call it a novel because it's based on the true stories of marching and protesting during the civil rights era, and so um, I think it's just really beautiful. Just a stunning imagery and beautifully done, and some lessons around that. So I thought those, all three of those, I think there are three, all three of those are really great. Well, it seems like we are rounding the corner on this discussion. Is there anything else that you wanted to share about the book or talk about the book that we didn't have a chance to discuss?
Such a cool cover. I love the cover, and it feels like 1999
Oh,
in
Okay,
a way.
that cover is way better than the cover I ended up with.
that's the one I
What?
do. Yeah,
Oh, no,
like
I
an
won't get it because of the
Mhm.
just not nearly as cool.
Yeah. Yeah, the paperback cover's much better. I'm definitely glad to have read this book, and it did have me. I mean, even though I remember them being in the news, and I was trying to think like, why didn't I remember them more? I'm also realizing this was right on the cusp of like Y2K because this is November 1999. So what was really big in the news and everybody's mind at that time was also like, is the world going to end when
yeah.
the computer stopped working? So that might have fogged some of it, but it still it was like a really good impetus to try to learn more about the protest, and that was and even like the protest methods. I'm gonna have to say I looked into a lot of what they were talking about, so um, it was very informative that way. And there were parts that I really did like. I liked Victor, and I thought the epilogue with Victor was really like really moving, and so yeah, I'm glad I read it. I got a lot out of it.
Yeah, beyond the nitpicks that we were going through, I did enjoy the book. Definite trigger warning though for violence, because it is very descriptive in things that were done to protesters.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that warning. I don't think I was even prepared for that level of detail. And there are sections where it's described, and you can feel the dehumanization so thoroughly that it's rough for sure. It's definitely rough. Yeah.
Yeah, there were parts I was reading where I was like, "Oh my!" I mean, I was like, I think my husband was like, "What are you reading?" I was just like, I just had never even heard of some of the methods that were used. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I'll ever get over them getting the Q-tips. I don't think I would.
no,
Yeah.
especially because they are like, "Oh, they went to the car to get the medical kit." And I'm like, "That's so nice. They're stopping now. They're going to help her." No,
Mhm.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
pretty graphic.
Deep breath.
Uh-huh.
Um, well, thank you again for having us. Really, really appreciate it. It's been such a pleasure talking with you all about these books and this month's read in particular. I've enjoyed my time, and so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too.